Okay. So today we are going to talk about the Mexican-American War, sometimes the United States-Mexican War. Uh, Many of you don't know this. When you look at the declared wars of the United States, there have only been five. And of course, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War One, and World War II. That's it. And so this is one of the five declared wars that we've had, which always shocks people a bit to know that that's all we've had. But before we get into the Mexican-American War, let's talk about Texas independence. Now, I'm not going to go to all the issues of why Texas declares independence. I usually do that in my Texas government class, which I'll probably try to do one of those over the summer. But they declared independence on March 2nd, 1836. I actually had somebody try to challenge me on that the other day. They go, but you don't know when Texas Independence Day is. I go, oh, shut up. And there are only really three major battles in the war for Texas independence. We already know about the Goliad, where we'll call them Texicans, I guess, surrender, about 300 of them, and they're immediately executed by Santa Anna and his troops, which helps you play into a part of why at the Alamo, they're not really interested in surrendering. Now, we all remember the Alamo. It's 188 Texans versus almost 4,000 Mexican troops under Santa Anna. The good news is that the Texans only lose 188 and Mexicans lose 1,500, but they only had 188 to begin with. It's interesting when you talk about political culture and political myths that are important to a state and a country. All countries have them. The Alamo certainly plays an impact there. The Alamo symbolizes in Texas a spirit of independence, the creation of something new. But there have been some historians who argue that there was one historian who was not very popular when he said it. He said, maybe we ought to rename it Fort Stupid, because he argues that everybody was stupid there, that the people in the Alamo should have left it and protected Sam Houston's flank. Santa Anna should just skip the Alamo and its 188 Texans and gone and wiped out whatever troops that Sam Houston had and end the war right then and there. And there's always this, the whole myth of the Alamo, especially that they all died. There's significant evidence that says that Davy Crockett didn't die in the battle, but was later executed by Santa Anna, claiming that, hey, I'm a congressman. And as we know, that would probably get you executed even today because people don't like Congress. Well, the last battle, obviously, a major battle is the Battle of San Jacinto, where Sam Houston and his army surprised Santa Anna's army. The Texans lose 9. The Mexicans lose about 630. They capture Santa Anna. They make him sign a treaty respecting Texas independence, and then they let him go. But when he goes back to Mexico, he renounces the treaty, which, by the way, in fairness to Santa Anna, that would make sense, right? Because if everybody's pointing guns at you, are you going to sign any document that they put in front of you? My guess is yes. If you want me to sign Brian Johnson's a jerk, I will certainly sign that if you're pointing a gun at me. Heck, I'd probably sign it if you weren't pointing a gun at me. But he did say, no, it's not a legal treaty. Well, interestingly enough, I was in 8th grade back in the 70s. Let's just go that route. And my history teacher, Oklahoma history teacher, told me this, and it has stuck with me. When Texas becomes independent, the first thing they do is they vote to be annexed into the United States. They want to be part of the United States. Well, my Oklahoma history teacher said, always remind the Texans that they were asked twice and they were rejected twice. The United States didn't want Texas. They weren't sure if they wanted Texas because they felt that it could mean war with Mexico, which it'll eventually do. And it was a slave state. And there were those who were saying, do we want to add another slave state and expand slavery out into the West? Now, Van Buren, who was president, we talked about him last time, he sort of dodges the issue. So does John Tyler, who took over for William Henry Harrison after he died. So that brings us to the election of 1844. The Democrats, Van Buren says, hey, I'm still around. why not nominate me again, but they won't. Um, they're going to choose sort of a dark horse candidate, James K. Polk out of North Carolina. Now, they like Polk because he favored taking Texas. He wanted to get California, and he wanted Oregon. And when I say he wanted Oregon, there was a debate on who should control Oregon. Should it be the United States or Great Britain? And if you remember back to the Convention of 1818 and the Rochambeau Agreement, they said that they would have joint occupation of Oregon and Washington. Well, now with this whole idea of manifest destiny that America should control the whole continent, there's a strong urging to get rid of the British out of there. Polk also said that he would lower the tariff. Now, the Whigs nominate Henry Clay. Okay, so now think about this. Henry Clay's now run 3 times for president, and he's not going to win here either, because no one remembers President Clay. So Polk won. So let's talk a little bit about James K. Polk. Now, James K. Polk is a one-term president. And for the most part, one-term presidents are considered failures, for the most part. But Polk is usually listed as one of the great presidents, even though he's a one-term president. So let's talk about him for a little bit. He's the youngest president at that time. He's 49. He had been a lawyer. He had studied mathematics, the classics at the University of North Carolina. He'd been the governor of Tennessee for 2 years. He'd been a member of Congress for 14 years. He had been the Speaker of the House for 4 years. So you're looking at, here's a man that's done it all. They nicknamed him Young Hickory. Andrew Jackson was Old Hickory. And so this is sort of a young Andrew Jackson. And he works 18 hours a day, which will eventually destroy his health. Part of his problem for that 18 hours is, people understand, is that back in those days, the way you got a government job is you went to see the president. I mean, you could walk up to the White House and knock on the door and say, I want to see the president, I want a job. In fact, Polk makes the complaint that he cannot even take a bath without people coming to his bathroom and opening the door while he's in the bathtub asking for a job. For me, I would have hired the first guy and say, your job is to keep everybody else out of my bathroom while I'm taking a bath. He also has a pro-slavery stance. He is a Southerner. And therefore, he's going to alienate some Northern Democrats. All right. So what are Polk's objectives? Like I said, he wants to reduce the tariff. He wants to settle the Oregon question with Great Britain, and he wants to acquire California. Now, earlier I had said he also wanted to annex Texas, but that was already underway. Since John Tyler was leaving office, he said, well, it looks like we want Texas, so we'll annex Texas. And Texas becomes a state on December 29th, 1845. December 29th, historic day for a couple of reasons. Texas becomes a state. It's also my birthday, not 1845 either. Let's just say 85 and go with that. So Oregon territory. So Texas out of the way, Oregon territory. Polk wants all of Oregon, and we're talking about all the way up into Vancouver, place in that area. Britain doesn't want to give it up, and Polk's ready to go to war. In fact, there was a slogan, 54-40 or fight, which is quite a slogan when you think about it, 54-40 or fight. That's the parallel that would have given us almost all of British Columbia. And this is something that, it's a reoccurring theme in American history, right? Is that the Americans would really like to have Canada. They've looked at Canada, they've hungered for Canada for a long time, and they're not getting it still. But they avoid war because both sides agree to the 49th parallel. Now, the 49th parallel is that parallel that you see crossing all the way from the Great Lakes over to the state of Washington. So Polk has now settled the Oregon question without a war. Texas is annexed. He's also got a bill through to reduce the tariff. So that just leaves him with California. Well, he tries to buy California for roughly $18 million. But Mexico will not sell. And would you blame him? Would we sell our country? Well, maybe Arkansas, but we'd keep the rest of it. So Polk decides that if Mexico won't sell, he will fight for what he gets. And so he's going to start a war with Mexico. He's going to send the army under General Zachary Taylor and his troops down to the Rio Grande. Now, this is important to note. The Rio Grande was not the official boundary of Texas. It was really the Nueces River. Mexico recognized Texas to the Nueces River, not to the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande was disputed territory. Um, and so Polk is sending an army down there to try to start a war. And on May 9th, Mexican soldiers kill 11 Americans. Now Polk can say, hey, Mexico has started a war, and his very claim to fame is that American blood has been spilt on American soil. That's his line. American blood spilt on American soil. And of course, Americans are furious about this. And so war is declared on May 13th, 1846. But there were a lot of people who were opposed to this war. And most of that opposition came from the New England states. John Quincy Adams, the former president, now serving in the House of Representatives, the only former president to do that, says the war is unrighteous. There was an obscure congressman out of Illinois who introduced resolutions, what he called spot resolutions. And in these spot resolutions, he's effectively calling Polk a liar. He's saying, show me the spot on American soil where American blood was spilled, because clearly that was disputed territory. This obscure congressman from Illinois will get the nickname Spotty Lincoln. It is, yes, Abraham Lincoln serving one term in Congress. Thank God Spotty Lincoln didn't stick with him, and Honest Abe goes a little bit better. Others will oppose the war on grounds that it would spread slavery. We already know that Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden, one of the first environmentalists, will go to jail for refusing to pay his poll taxes because he doesn't want to support the war because it's going to be used to expand slavery. And it's a very racial war. Make no mistake about it. You can go back and there's, I can't remember the author because I read it 30 years ago. Forgive me. It's called Race and Manifest Destiny. And you look at the speeches on the House, and here are congressmen saying that the best thing that could happen to a Mexican woman was to marry a white man. There's a lot of racism in this whole war. Now, preparing for war, the U.S. Army is not ready because Americans don't like large standing armies. That's something new in the 1950s. The Army is about 7,000 people, and they're inexperienced. Now, the Mexican Army has about 32,000 people, but most of them were forced into the Army or they were taken from prisons, and they are not motivated. But by the end of the war, the U.S. Army will be 104,000 strong because people will volunteer. They will form their own units. Daniel Webster, who opposed the war, his son will sign up for the war. Henry Clay, son, signs up for the war and is killed. This was a time period, and again, I think it's a lot different today, right? That when you went to war and you were from a privileged family, you were supposed to go. Your job was to volunteer and go. And I think you saw that probably the last time in a real strong manner in World War II, right? When you saw the Bushes, you saw the Kennedys, but you don't see it as often anymore. I mean, you saw Al Gore go and, to Vietnam, you saw Joe Biden's late son go, but for the most part, the elites don't send their kids. It's other people do it. But back then, it was supposed to. Well, these volunteers lacked uniforms. There was no standard equipment. There was no discipline. They often, when there's a battle going on, they'll rampage out of control, raping, stealing, murdering. One English correspondent described them as wild-looking, hairy-faced savages. And of course, to be fair, this did not make the U.S. Army happy at all. They didn't like this, but they dealt with what they had. And of course, there were a lot of Texas Rangers that were involved in here that were looking for revenge. And they were involved often in murder, yelling, remember the Goliad and remember the Alamo, as they indiscriminately killed people. Yet, even though that these volunteers had no really solid equipment, standard equipment, uniforms, or discipline, they constantly defeat larger Mexican forces. Mainly because the Mexican Army had problems with training, and weapons. Their cannons were so obsolete in terms of range that American soldiers could just dodge cannonballs as they rolled past them. Americans had what they called their flying artillery. They had artillery that were hooked to horses that could be moved very quickly and fire. There's actually a song written about a major who's killed with his flying artillery. I can't remember the name of the song, but I would sing it for you, but why ruin your evening? Like many cases, like we've seen in these previous wars, the U.S. has no plan of action for the war. They don't know what they want to do. Polk knows this, though. He wants a war that's big enough to have a treaty to get him what he wants, California and these new places. But he also wants a war that doesn't go on too long and is small enough, because what wars create are war heroes. And what do war heroes do? They run for president. And so Polk is not wanting that. Now, at first he chooses Winfield Scott to run the army, but Polk's a Democrat, Scott is a Whig. They argue all the time. So he says, nope, not going to be able to use Winfield Scott. Although, to be fair, Winfield Scott is going to be a great general in the Civil War, although he's old. He really creates the plan that defeats the South in the long run. So, since he can't get along with Winfield Scott, he chooses Zachary Taylor. Now, Zachary Taylor is known as Old Rough and Ready. He wears a straw hat, dusty trousers. I mean, he's not your spit and polish general. He mends his own clothes. He's got a dirty brown overcoat. He's outspoken. He's sort of a crusty person. He cusses a lot. And he's sort of a real folk hero, sort of a populist. And so he'd already won some minor battles. And so we're going to go with him. Meanwhile, in California, Polk had long wanted California. And he will try to get it before war is declared. His goal was to try to start some sort of Texas-style revolt, get some people there, and then have them revolt against Mexican rule. So in June of 1846, John Fremont and Kit Carson, along with 60 other frontiersmen, declared California a republic. And there's a great book on this too by, his name is Hampton Sides. And if you read about Hampton Sides, he's got a book on Kit Carson. It's about 400 pages, but Kit Carson leads this really fascinating life, and it goes into a little bit of this revolt. So California, they have a revolt. There's not a lot of Mexicans in California enough to really stop it. It's called the Bear Flag Revolt because the bear becomes the symbol. They declare California an independent nation, which it is for about 30 days. So when you hear Texas about being the only state that was an independent nation, not true. California was, so was Hawaii. But California is only independent for about 30 days until the U.S. Navy arrives and says that California is now U.S. territory. So he's got that. So back over. And they created, by the way, a similar revolt in New Mexico, where there'd already been a strong U.S. presence. And if you get a chance, read the book on Kit Carson and his time in New Mexico. So back over to Texas. California has already been taken. New Mexico's been taken before Taylor fights his first major battle. Taylor is moving very slow. He has to. He has to wait for supplies. He has to wait for men. It's slow going. In September of 1846, he finally heads south. His first goal is Monterey, which he takes 5 days later. Now, Polk is getting unhappy with Taylor. He thinks that he's moving too slowly. And this is partly because Polk had never seen the Mexican desert. He thought that Taylor and his men could just live off the land and they wouldn't need a lot of supplies. Well, if you've been in that area, you know that's not true. And Polk is also duped by Santa Anna. Now, Santa Anna had been deposed as the ruler of Mexico in 1844 and had fled to Cuba. Interestingly enough, Santa Anna had spent some time in New York, where he popularized a candy called chicle, which we know as gum. So the next time that you step in some gum, take a few moments to go, curse you, Santa Anna. Well, Santa Anna told Polk, and Santa Anna was living in Cuba at this time, he said, look, if you get me back into Mexico, I will sell you what you want, and that's over. Because I just want to be back into Mexico and rule. So Polk says, sure, okay. And so they get Santa Anna back in. The Mexican government's in turmoil anyway. And as soon as Santa Anna gets in power, he says, death to the gringos, right? In other words, Polk has taken Mexico's best general and returned into power, which makes sense. There's no way that Santa Anna could have come in there, taken power, and sold most of their country to the Americans. So in October of 1846, Polk, tired of waiting, says, all right, we're going to try something new. I'm tired of waiting for Zachary Taylor, moves too slow. We're going to take Mexico City by invading Veracruz. And by the way, Veracruz is where everybody invades. Cortez invades there. The Americans are going to invade there. During the Civil War, the French invade through Veracruz. So if you're ever thinking about invading Mexico, I guess Veracruz is the way to go. Well, this left Taylor and his forces idle. He said, we're not going to do it. And Polk said, you just sit where you are. Well, Taylor did not like these orders, and nor did he like the fact that Winfield Scott was now going to lead the attack on Mexico City. So Taylor says, screw that. I'm going to disobey my orders and attack anyway. And this is going to be the Battle of Buena Vista. It's going to be Taylor's untested volunteers, and this is February of 1847, versus Santa Anna's large and pretty untrained army. Santa Anna asked the Americans if they want to surrender. They sent a note in. Taylor's reply was, tell them to go to HELL, don't cuss, and the battle takes place. And there's a great YouTube video showing how the maneuvering of the forces go, which is pretty fascinating, but we don't have time to see that here. The Americans win the battle, and the hero of that battle was Zachary Taylor's son-in-law, a Colonel Jefferson Davis, who turned out to be the hero. They almost captured Santa Anna here. Santa Anna had to flee from his carriage and get on a horse and get away. And what's an interesting story about that is that Santa Anna was missing a leg because it had been blown off in a cannon accident. Well, the group that almost captured him was the Illinois militia. What they do capture is his silverware, his carriage, and his fake leg. And if you want to see his silverware, his carriage, and his fake leg, go to Springfield, Illinois, yes, where Abraham Lincoln is buried, go to the National Guard Armory, and it's there. I went there, and I said, I'm from Texas, I want to see the leg, and they said, you're not taking it, and I go, look, I'm not really planning on taking the leg, I just want to see the leg. And there's been some debate between the Mexican government and the U.S. government. They'd like to have the leg. Texans want one of their battle flags back, but neither side is going to do it. Well, in March, by the way, and then Taylor goes home. By the way, Taylor's going to run for president. There you go. March 9th, 1847, Scott leads his army on the beaches of Veracruz with 14,000 troops. They begin their march on Mexico City on September 13th, 1847. They begin a siege of Mexico City. In this case, the hero of this is going to be an engineer, a captain by the name of Robert E. Lee, that's doing a lot of the work. And it becomes a fairly quick battle, and Santa Anna flees the country. And so the war is going to end with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed February 2nd, 1848. You don't need to know that. That's not for testing purposes, because we don't have tests in this class, oddly enough. And here's what the treaty said. Mexico gave up all claims to Texas above the Rio Grande and ceded California and New Mexico to the U.S. in return for $18 million, what we originally offered them. Now, Polk thought about taking all of Mexico. He said, well, we're here. Why don't we just take the whole country? But he was afraid that he might lose what he had. And he's going to decide that he's not going to run again. Again, here's a president, and this is why he's listed up here. He's going to run for one term, and he had said he was going to run for one term. He said he was going to do the following things, and he accomplishes all those things, and then dies about 4 months after he leaves office because his health had deteriorated. But let's talk about the war's legacy. For the United States, there were about 1,700 killed in battle. All these people went there thinking this would be glorious, we're going to have glory, and these battles would be fabulous, we'll tell people. 1,700 killed in battle. But really about 13,000 Americans died in the war. 11,000 died of disease. And this is typical, by the way, all the way up until World War II. Most people, or World War One rather, most people are going to die of disease rather than battlefield wounds. And Laura, you probably know this as well as everybody, with just the amount of poor sanitation. They didn't know how to treat wounds. It was terrible. The cost was roughly about $98 million, but a good deal for the United States. They got 1 million square miles, great harbors, 1 million square miles of California, New Mexico, all that territory, great harbors in California, and Lord knows how much mineral wealth they received. And the war is really several firsts for the United States. It's the first war covered by reporters. You actually had reporters reporting stories and sending it back. You didn't see reporters in the War of 1812 or any other war, but it's going to be covered by reporters, worldwide reporters. It's going to be the Americans' first successful offensive war. Remember, in the War of 1812, it was a disaster every time they tried to invade Canada. And it was America's first war in which they had an amphibious assault. They were able to take troops, cross the sea, land them in another country, and fight a successful battle. It's the first combat experience for a lot of people. U.S. Grant. Now, Grant's not very into the battles. He's actually sort of the wagon master, managing stores and supplies. We've already mentioned Robert E. Lee. Stonewall Jackson is in this battle, George Meade, George McClellan. A lot of these people that fight in the Civil War are getting their first combat experience here. And so it's interesting to point out that when we get to the Civil War, that all of these generals, there's not any idea that some generals are superior than the other. They've all been through the same training. They've all read the same books. They've all studied the same tactics. Now, immediately after the war was considered a great victory. But subsequently, it was looked at a little bit harsher as sort of a land grab. If you read Grant's autobiography, which is even today considered one of the best autobiographies of a president, it's a very humble one. He says it was an unrighteous war and full of regret. They felt so bad about it, they gave the territory back, which they didn't. But there's, when you hear about it today, there's all this talk about a larger number of immigrants coming in and the reconquest of the area. But you usually find that when immigrants come in, they also become very Americanized. So that's the end of the Mexican-American War, our second declared war. And that's where we'll stop today. The next week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Compromise of 1850, and we're going to get into the antebellum period, which is a fascinating period. And we'll talk about the Old South, the myth of the Old South, like when you watch Gone with the Wind or something like that, and the breakup of certain parties over the issue of slavery. We're building up to the Civil War, and probably in 2 weeks, we will begin the Civil War. And in 3 weeks, we'll be hitting Reconstruction. Reconstruction is a critical period that's often overlooked in American politics. So thank you for coming today.